Good morning, everyone. Welcome to a practical guide to guided analytics. So this is where you'll learn how to make dashboards that just work. So dashboards that deliver great analytical value that will delight your end users. Now, guided analytics is a Tableau design concept, which is perfect for creating dashboards that hold the use of actions and interactivity in order to get to a point where there's a lot of deep insight available in your dashboards, and they also consider good performance in equal balance. Now, this is one of my favorite topics, but before I get too carried away into it, I'll just introduce myself a little bit. So my name's Adam. I manage a team of product experts based in London. And having worked directly with customers for a number of years, I've picked up some tips and tricks on how to make dashboards more effective, which I'll hopefully share with you guys today. Now, a fun fact about me is that despite sounding like an American, I'm actually a very proud Englishman. Now, this is particularly weird because I've never spent any time living in the States, nor have I any American heritage. So I'm an American-sounding Englishman, otherwise known as a freak. If you'd like to know why, then feel free to come up and ask after the session. I'll tell you all about it. It's kind of an interesting story. Now, the other thing worth sharing is that I'm a very enthusiastic eater. I love to eat, as in I have an insatiable appetite. I'm serious, it's pretty bad. In fact, the first thing that I did when I landed in Vegas on Saturday was go to Caesar's Palace to attend the legendary Bacchanal buffet. I had dreams in the lead up to it. It was amazing. As you can see, I was completely in my element. Now, this is the perfect segue into an example of how taking a guided analytics approach has helped me with the analysis that I do on a personal level. And that happens to be when I analyze my own eating habits. So, let's start with this dashboard. This is a dashboard that I created off of some data that I obtained from an app called MyFitnessPal. Quick show of hands. Who has heard of or used MyFitnessPal? Lovely. Okay, so for the brief period you guys had your hands up, I would have said about 70% of the room have at least heard of it. Now, for the folks that don't know what it is, it's essentially a calorie counter, or just a great way to keep tabs on what you've been eating at any point during the day. And I've used it for the past 4 years just to keep a diary of what I eat. Not because I'm on any particular plan over that 4-year period, but because it's interesting and I want to put it in Tableau and make visualizations. Now, the reason I do that is because I want to answer some questions of the data. So I want to figure out how much I'm eating on any given day, as well as some general trends. And so when I first joined Tableau, I made this dashboard. Now, I sort of tried to apply the TC theme to it, but this is pretty much what I had going. And to be honest, I was a little bit proud of it. It answers all the questions that I had, like how much am I eating on any given day. I can look up, it's got the perfect visualization there. I can look up the specific foods that I've been eating, and it gives me some general trends, and I've got some fun interactive filters to help me drill down into various areas of the data. Now, that said, it's a little bit overwhelming. There's a lot going on. I don't really know where to start, even though it's my own data. So when I came across the principles of guided analytics, I thought, okay, that's interesting. Making dashboards more consumable and clear is something that I could probably apply to this piece of work. So this is an example of the same dashboard, but with the principles of guided analytics applied to it. So as you'll see, it's a little more stripped back, and it really focuses on the main message that I wanted to put across in the data. So just to start, I can figure out what I've eaten on various days, and I can pick out very easily some outliers here. So One stands out, which I've sort of indicated with a little red marker. So on the 1st of January, I started the year off pretty hot by eating 7,500 calories worth of food. Now, what dashboards are really good at, in theory, is being able to answer the second question and the third question. So the second question I had when I saw this was, what the heck did I eat? Does anyone want to know what I ate? All right, let's find out. So what you can do here is make a selection and drill down into a breakdown of how I spent my calories per meal. And as you can see, I had a pretty sizable lunch, and we can hover over and check out what I actually ate. So some spicy Italian sausage, some lasagna, some spaghetti, etc. So on New Year's Day, it's tradition in my family to eat a buttload of Italian. So that's how I spent my lunch. I was a little full, so I just had a PB&J for dinner, but I still managed to consume a few extra things before the day was gone. So I was able to drill down into that, but I can also get a view of my micro and macro breakdowns of the particular food items, and it gives me a general sense of the trends of how I eat. So one example is I'm pretty disciplined, actually, over most of the course of the week, but I go absolutely ham towards the end. So Friday, Saturday, Sunday, it's pretty intense, but then I sort of start again on Monday. Sound familiar to anyone? Yeah, okay. So the ability to get those answers was made so much easier by making things clear, making things interactive, so that I could drill down into the appropriate levels of data within the right context so that I would understand what's happening. All right. So what you saw of the initial dashboard was sort of a classic example of overcomplicating the composition to the detriment of general clarity and potentially performance as well. Now, what you may come to find over time is that this is actually a really common problem, and it wasn't just me. I see a lot of customers struggling with issues of making sure dashboards are clear and that information is accessible in the right way. And actually, when I took a moment to think about it, it actually makes a lot of sense that it's a pretty common problem. Because with the increasing volumes of data that we have available to work with now, and the ease in which we can create pretty monstrous things of dashboards, we all too often end up with dashboards like these. So we either have information overload with too many things all at once, or it just takes too much time to load, in which case it's not fit for purpose. So the challenge we have is pretty pervasive. It's an extensive thing and requires some practical advice, which is why this session is targeted towards an advanced audience. Now that said, if you feel closer, if you resonate closer to the intermediate end of the spectrum, then fear not. Many of the techniques we'll cover today will be familiar. Now, what I want to do is arm you folks with some practical techniques, and what's key is some idea of how to combine those techniques in order to create dashboards that hold analytical depth and user experience in equal balance. Now, ultimately, we all want a dashboard that provides a clear and fast path to relevant information. And that's where guided analytics can help. Now, the concept can be defined in various ways depending on the context, but overall, I like to describe it as a modular approach to creating intuitive, insightful, and scalable dashboards. So if we break that down into 3 core principles, it starts with, number 1, dashboards should be intuitive. So they should be simple enough for new users to be able to immediately feel familiar with how to use the dashboard, as well as understand the information that's to be shared from that dashboard. 2, dashboards should be insightful. So they should prescribe key information, but still allow users to drill down into their own trains of thought when they need to. And 3, dashboards should be scalable. So they should be able to provide some good a good level of performance at all levels of analysis despite the volumes of data at play. So the techniques I'll cover today will speak directly to those principles. And by the end of the session, you'll be completely equipped to make sure your dashboards are more intuitive, more insightful, and more scalable. Now, since this is a practical guide, I will actually be applying these techniques to a dashboard as we go along. So just to introduce the data set that the dashboard uses, it's fairly sizable, and the topic of the data set is domestic flights in the USA. Now, at a row level, or a row represents every flight per operator per day since the turn of the century. And at nearly 92 million rows, there's huge potential to create something horrifically complex and slow and terrible. So it's a good thing I'm going to do it in front of 1,000 people. OK, let's get things rolling with core principle number 1. Dashboards should be intuitive. So the key to this is to ensure you design dashboards to be simple, to be instructive, and most importantly, to be relevant. So design for the intended audience. It's sort of a fundamental that you've probably heard already, but it's easily forgotten, probably as easily forgotten as it is simple. Now, a significant portion of the failed dashboards I see out in the real world fail because, well, not because they weren't well put together, actually, but because they weren't really what the people needed. And that can be either in terms of the actual information or the way that it was delivered. Now, I think that just comes down to the fact that it's pretty easy to create something for yourself, but to create something of lasting value for someone else, it is something that requires a bit more thought. So, design for the intended audience, always. Now, all dashboards we create will serve a purpose of some sort, but it's very common to try to fulfill that purpose with a lot of different charts to answer a lot of different questions, and that's when the message and the end user is likely going to get lost. But that's actually OK. It's part of the iterative design process. It just means you're not done. What you want to do is continue to distill down what you've got until you have a fine selection of relevant visualizations that best answer the message you're trying to put across. So one little tagline is, if you remember to refine, your dashboards will shine. So once the message is honed, you can start thinking about the arrangement of your sheets. Now, the layout here is important because it determines the intuitive flow that your dashboard has and how the information is going to be communicated to the user. And the flow is somewhat dictated by how we expect to read things. So take Western society as an example. We tend to read from left to right, top to bottom. And so inherently, the top left of any dashboard is probably going to be an area that someone's going to gravitate towards for key information. So by being aware of these sweet spots, you can arrange your visualizations by priority so that your key views make the biggest impact. Next up, titles. I actually love titles. Titles put the guide in guided analytics. Without them, your users are just flying blind. So in school, we're taught in English class, or at least I was, that titles are things that you craft in order to best inform, or to create some sort of intrigue. Now, those lessons should definitely be applied here as well. Now, in this example, notice the call to action in sort of the subheader. Select an airline and/or year to filter by. So with the verbiage there, it's pretty useful, and you shouldn't be afraid of being explicit in terms of how your dashboard should be used. For a lot of folks, actually, the concept of an interactive visualization is pretty alien. So informative titles will definitely help them use your dashboard the way you intended it to be used. OK, so it's a little unlikely that you'll find titles as awesome as I do, but sometimes I win people over when I talk about dynamic titles. So in this example, the selected area, all airlines, represents a dynamic area in the title there. Now, quick show of hands. Who is familiar with the ability to insert a field into a title so that it's dynamic? Okay, a lot of you. So a lot of you will be familiar with the little limitation of seeing all, the word all, when all the attributes are relevant for the view. Now, that's fine, but sometimes it just doesn't make sense or it's somewhat annoying. So sometimes what I do is use a little more advanced combination of calculations to achieve a level of customization that I want. And so I'll be sharing how I do that in a second. Now, sometimes as well, you'll be in a situation where your users need even more guidance. And in those cases, just give them the manual. So Tableau has this fairly new ability to show and hide containers. And that's pretty good for storing things like supplementary visualizations or parameter controls. But you can also overlay text on top of the views that you've got on your dashboard. And that text is an opportunity to explain exactly what's going on, how to interpret the visualization, and how to interact with it. OK, so that's plenty of theory for now. Let's dive into a practical exercise. Let me switch my screen. OK, so here's a bit of a starter for 10 in terms of my dashboard. I've got most of the components that I would want for it, but let's start with making sure that we've got a focused message. And I want to focus on a particular area of the data. So there's a lot going on here. There's information about delays, cancellations, deviations, flight paths, all these things. I really want to focus on the cancellations, because I find that interesting. So I'll just use my title to really define what I'm focusing on. All right, just center that. Now, next up is refining the message. And I want to make sure that I've got what I need to absolutely answer the most basic set of questions and get rid of the clutter that may well confuse people. So just to strip it back, I'm going to get rid of this view, which takes a look at sort of the row level. This one I'm not ready for, so I'll go ahead and get rid of that one. Even this map, which shows the paths between origins and destinations, I'll just remove from the dashboard as well. And I'm going to go ahead and get rid of these filters because there's a better way. So just paying attention again to positioning, I want to be able to provide folks the option of analyzing which airlines experience the most cancellations over the years that are in the data set. And at that point, focus on where this is all happening. All right, so next up, I should probably define what each of these charts are. So I'll just call this yearly cancellation rate by airline. And I'm anticipating being able to use this view as a way of filtering the rest of the dashboard. So I'll just go ahead and add some instruction here. OK, so some simple things like changing the font size and coloring can really help make this feel even more intuitive for the user. So I'll just go ahead and spend a second making that right. And with that context, hopefully this is something that's going to make a lot more sense immediately when someone arrives at this dashboard. Now, if you weren't familiar with being able to insert a field in a title to make it dynamic, I'll just show that here. So what you can do is use this insert dropdown to put in a certain field that's part of the sheet that this title belongs to. And I might want to put in something like origin airport code or something like airline. Now, what you'll see here is that you're getting that classic all, which you can sort of do stuff with, but it's a little annoying. So what I'll do is show you how I can put a more customized title in there to represent what I want to display. So this is more of what I want. I want to say cancellations by origin for all airlines. Now, it's easy enough to add airlines to the end, but I also want to provide the ability to show the year where relevant, and for that whole concept to not be present if no one selected a year. So how do you get around the all there? So the key thing here is a couple of calculated fields that I've put onto the text box. So just to drill into how I did that. OK, so I've just got a simple logic function here to say, OK, if there are many years in the view, then give me essentially nothing in quotation marks. Otherwise, return the year. And so this way, rather than getting an all if there's more than 1 year selected, I have a blank, so assuming we're just looking at all years. So this is a great way to sort of customize your titles and be able to make sure it's as intuitive as possible. And after creating those calculations, it's a case of putting it onto our text tile and adding it to the set of strings here. All right. So once that's created, we can add that title to the dashboard. Get rid of the old one, get rid of the title for the title. And we have something that's a lot more custom. And so later on in these practical exercises, we'll see how that changes when we filter. So last thing here is I want to make sure we have a manual for folks who have no idea as to how they might use this. So something that's relatively new, as I mentioned, was the ability to add in a floating container, which has a show hide option. So to access that option, you just need to go to this dropdown and select the Add Show Hide button option. So this gives you a little icon which users can select to make sure that the container shows up or goes away. Now with this container, I'm going to place over the visualizations themselves. And what I'm going to do as well is just color it a similar color to the background. Let's try this one. And make it slightly transparent so folks can see the visualizations I'm talking about, but at the same time, be able to see the text that I'll apply here. So if I make this a little bigger, I might want to start with heat map. And then for time, I'll just put instructions here. And a similar thing for the other one. Map. All right, so I think you guys get the idea. And you can really build this up so that it's quite in-depth, quite descriptive, and there's really no reason to have to hand over a separate document, which I know sometimes happens with really chunky dashboards. You just have a set of instructions built in, and a user can use a button to either show or hide that, and it'll be a lot more intuitive for them. All right, so that was cool. And the overarching lesson, I guess, to that is that simplicity is key to any intuitive dashboard. So the first step was really to just strip everything back and make sure the basics are right. Now, in our pursuit to inform the masses with everything that you might want to know, it's very easy to allow some complexity into your dashboard. Just be careful about whether that spoils the user experience for them. Now, designing an instinctive and an intuitive dashboard on purpose requires some thought. So make sure you take the necessary time it would take you to plan out how your approach is going to be for that dashboard. So those are some tips on how to make dashboards a lot more intuitive. So fairly basic. But now let's go into principle number 2, how to make dashboards more insightful. So dashboards should be able to prescribe key information, but still allow users to pursue their own trains of thought through the levels of data that's available. Now, one very effective way of prescribing information is through something called bands, or BANs, otherwise known as big-ass numbers. That's fun to say in public. Now, they're typically a collection of KPIs that are often found at the top of a dashboard. And the reason they have become a big thing in the community is well, it's down to some research done by the amazing Amy Alberts of Tableau, who found that the human eye seems to gravitate towards these big-ass numbers. Now, we can't seem to help but be captivated by these. Now, in a way, it sort of makes sense. It's a really fast path to the important information that they're probably looking for when they visit a dashboard. So it makes total sense to include them. So give people big-ass numbers. Now, another technique for enriching the level of insight someone will gain from a visualization is a visit tooltip. Now, it's something that came with a lot of fanfare when it was released, and I think that was justified. It's a fantastic way to offer supplementary information as part of the dashboard, and it adds a lot of detail without adding a single mark to the initial view. So in terms of performance, in terms of rendering, there isn't an additional mark to be drawn here. It also means that you don't have to add additional clutter to your initial view. So a really great way to save some real estate that can be better served on something else. Plus, they look kind of cool, so I would totally adopt that little tip. Now, something else that comes with a little less fanfare is the highlight action. Now, to be honest, I didn't really use highlight actions a lot in the past, but they have really grown on me. Now, what's great about highlight actions is you can call out a data point and its equivalent across different sheets on a dashboard. And this really helps ensure that the context is maintained so that a user can consider the wider impact of a certain data point that they're looking at on a dashboard. So I actually think that's quite powerful. Now, something that interactive dashboards are really good at is helping end users pursue their own trains of thought and asking that second question off of the initial question that we saw in the initial example. And filter actions are the perfect way of facilitating that. So by using a visualization to filter other visualizations, and by doing that, you're able to explore and compare and view data in different SKUs and different perspectives and offer different answers to folks. Now, that flexibility really engages folks and helps them find the relevant insights that they might be looking for. Now, filter actions also give users the ability to drill through to different levels of granularity in the data. And by combining them with some smart use of layout containers, you can actually guide your end users towards different levels of granularity in the data, revealing great detail when it's needed, and making sure it's not adding to clutter or performance load when it's not needed. So the last thing, set actions. If you haven't heard about set actions, I want to know where you've been in the last 6 months, because they have been absolutely everywhere. Now, the set action means that the value of the selection you make on a visualization can be stored in a set. Okay, that's cool. These can then be used in a visualization either just being applied to the marks card or in calculations. And what that means is so many possibilities and options when it comes to built-in expressive interactivity. In this example, it's a fairly simple one. The set action detects which airline is being selected and adds that airline to a set, which is applied onto color on the bar chart. And what the bar chart represents is the proportion that, in this case, a particular airline contributes to the overall KPI. So the proportion they contribute to cancellations, delays, et cetera. And that level of insight with this proportional brushing is made possible really easily with set actions. And that's only one application of them. So they deserve their own set of sessions. If you haven't been to one, I would definitely recommend checking out set actions in more detail. All right, so it feels like time for another practical. So let's switch screen. All right, how to make dashboards insightful. Let's start off with some bands. So I've got myself started just because there's a few things to add here. I wanted to add sort of the main number, the main KPI, but I also like to add a sort of a sense of the trend, both in terms of year-over-year progression, but also beyond that, how things have developed over the years in this case for that KPI. But I'll just complete this. So I'll add in my airline KPI, or rather my flights trend, flights KPI, get rid of those titles, because there's a title built in. Okay, now enriching the view with a Vision tooltip. So let's go for the map. I want to be able to see per origin, per airport, essentially, what the most popular destinations are. And I don't want to have to add another visualization. I just want to be able to hover over an airport and see where people typically go. So here I can just go to the sheet under tooltip. So I've made use of some formatting just to make the information I'm hovering over very clear. But I can also add a sheet to this so that I can see the most frequently visited destinations per airport. And when I hover over, if I zoom out a little bit, let me find a better example. I can see the most frequently visited airports for any given airport. Okay, let's go back to the dashboard. Now, highlight actions, my new semi-favorite action of the day. So if I go to dashboards and the actions menu, let's try that again. Here I can add all sorts of types of actions, in this case, a highlight action. Now, a pro tip here is to be able to multi-select the different sheets that could be your source sheets. Now, it's a little tedious having to unclick all of these, but what you can do is just hold down your mouse, your cursor, and make a multi-selection, and all of those will be unticked. Then you can approach this with a bit more control. So I want my trend charts to drive this highlight. So anything with trend on the end of it, I will add. There we go. And I will target my airlines view as well as all the other trends. Now, doing this will allow me to hover over a particular year and be able to see that year in some of the other representations or the other metrics for the same year. So I can sort of compare and see the wider context to that particular year. And I'll have that occur upon a hover action, and I'll target a specific field, this time being year, so that I can be a bit more precise about my querying. And I'll sort of touch upon the benefits of that in a bit. So I'll hit OK here. Let's check out the effect of that. So now when I hover over a particular year, I can see the development of that year when it comes to delayed flights, late flights, diverted flights, as well as per airline as well. OK. So next up, a pretty basic filter action, but it's going to lead on to being able to drill down into some deep answers. So again, I'll just use the airline sheet as my source sheet. And upon a selection, I want to be able to filter my map. So my map is called Origins. Hit OK, and now I'm going to be being able to filter by airline and by year. So I can look at where certain operators fly out of and what effect that has on the information. So what I want to be able to do next is, OK, take the map of Origins and be able to drill down into a lower level of detail, because I want more. So first thing to do is just add that second layer onto the dashboard. So I've got a blank sheet here. And the reason it's blank is because this sheet actually holds quite a bit of data, which would take a bit of time to render. So what I've done is just pause querying for that sheet. And that's a bit of a pro tip. If you're working with a lot of data and it's taking time between each step, just being able to pause, complete your steps, and then let Tableau catch up once you've done everything you want to do is just a smarter way of working. So now that that sheet is there, I'll go back to my Actions menu. And add a new filter action. And this time, I'm going to get my origin map. Zoom in a little. Again, upon a selection, I'm going to filter my destinations map. Now, the key thing here is I want to exclude all values when I've cleared the selection. Because this is a more granular view, I don't want to necessarily expose this initially to the end user. I want it to hide away until I need it. And so excluding all values is going to let me do that. Now, it's not the only thing at play when it comes to making sure things expand and collapse away. What we have to do is make sure that the two visualizations that you want to use as part of that process exist in the same space, the same container. Now, do we have any container experts in the room? If you feel like you know containers really well, go ahead and put your hand up. OK, we've got about 4 hands. That sort of tells a story in itself, right? Now, a little tip on containers is if you double-click an object, you'll be able to find the container it sits within because it highlights in blue. So just to play that again, sheets are highlighted in gray. And if I double-click the header of the sheet, it'll show me the blue outline of the container, the area that it sits within. And the key thing here is that it's in the same area as the map, which is perfect, because I want the map to take up the rest of the room after I've cleared the selection. So when I select an airport, the map populates and shows up with the destinations that are popular for that airline in that year for that airport. And when I deselect my selection, it hides away. In fact, I'll just get rid of this so that it collapses away even further. So that's the type of thing you can do to ensure that your users can drill down into lower levels of detail in a smart way, ensures there's no clutter, and it means the initial render time of your dashboards. It's going to be a little more snappy. Now, the next thing I want to do is enhance the level of interactivity with a set action. So if you've never used a set action before, I would, as I said, definitely try to get into it because they're super powerful. One quick example is how it can be used for proportional brushing. So if we take this sheet, for example, go here, it's really just a set of percent of total calculations on the different KPIs, so canceled flights, delayed flights, etc. And the first step is to create a set. Now the set is going to be the different airlines. So let's find the airline name. Create a set. Now, it doesn't actually matter what's in this set because the point is we're going to use interactivity to define what belongs in that set. So we could select nothing, we could select something. Okay, so set 1, we want to use to color or proportionally brush these bars. So I'll go ahead and put that onto color. So now we've got a lovely gray to represent every other airline. And we've got blue to represent Endeavor's contribution to that particular KPI. And what we'll be able to do is once we set up a set action, so change set values, we can get our airlines heat mapped to determine the value of that set. So upon a selection, we're both going to filter the map, but also proportionally brush that bar chart. Is it working? Missed a step. You got to define the set of effects. There we go. And there you have it. Some interesting ways to add interactivity to make sure it's engaging as well as insightful. All right, so essentially what we were doing there was utilize Tableau's powerful drill down abilities to move through the different levels of data in a humanly consumable way. So let's take time. So time as a abstract example here. So we offer the user a guided experience to drill down from the highest level, years, all the way down to the lowest levels of granularity, which in this example might be hours. So the reason why that's good is because if you started at the lowest level of detail every hour, it's going to be really hard for a human being to be able to absorb that volume of information. But by being able to drill down in these steps means that the users can maintain the context to what they're looking at. So when they get down to the very, very most granular level of data, they know what it means and what it's impacted. All right, principle number 3. Dashboards should be scalable. So be able to provide a platform of good performance on all levels of analysis despite the volumes of data at play. So I often like to start with this one. Once you've created a dashboard and you publish it onto Tableau Server or Tableau Online, that platform will try to build up a cache so that the dashboard can be reused, or parts of the dashboard can be reused to render the view once it's been initially rendered by other users. Now, the idea is to save time for you in terms of load time and effort for Tableau. Now, a dashboard set to automatic sizing will constantly be changing in its size dimensions, and as well as the layout and placement of certain objects on that dashboard. And what that does is it forces Tableau to rebuild every part from scratch, rather than leveraging any cache that was previously built up. Now, the cache can be best leveraged when the size dimensions of the dashboard remain fixed and constant. And so I would recommend using fixed size where possible. And you can do that there. So earlier we covered filter actions. And they're a great way to provide an alternative way of filtering to the more traditional filters. Now, I would never say don't use traditional filters, but the performance impact should certainly be considered, especially when you've got a lot of filters on your dashboard. So for every filter that exists on a dashboard, Tableau is put to work for both rendering the filter itself, the object, the options that you're able to choose, as well as the filtering process itself. Now, just to emphasize that point, let's play a quick game of Spot the Difference. Here we have performance recordings of each of my example dashboards. So the one on the top being my initial attempt, and the one on the bottom being the dashboard that incorporates the principles of guided analytics. And you'll notice that the one on the top, the original one, takes a little more time to render. And this is the filters populating and showing up on the dashboard, whereas in the one beneath, there's literally only one filter to render, so not much time was needed at all. The other thing to notice here is that these are being rendered sequentially rather than in parallel. Now, the reason for that is because the option of use only relevant values is being put to use here. And what that does is it tells Tableau that one filter, the values of one filter is going to be determined by the setup of another filter. And because of that, because it's dependent on another filter, it has to be sequential. Tableau has to know what the values are of one filter in order to know the makeup of the other. And what that means is rendering in a sequential fashion, which just elongates the entire period that you have to wait for something to load for you. So something to be aware of with traditional filtering. Another pro tip is to be able to refine the queries that are being sent with your filter actions. Now, it's generally handy to be aware of what's happening under the hood when you're using Tableau, because then it offers up opportunities for you to optimize what's happening. Now, one such opportunity is to be able to define specifically what fields you're filtering by when you set up actions. Now, in this example, we've got that heat map, which is just the annual cancellation rate by airline, and we're using it to filter our proportional brushing bar chart, and we're using year specifically. Now, by default, if we had the default all fields selected, this would be passing through both year as well as the airline. But that isn't necessary. So by defining just year as the condition that we want to be filtering by, we can just make that slightly more efficient for us. Now, connecting to data correctly is something that's always going to be important when creating a dashboard that's going to be able to scale and be performant. I'm sure you guys know all about live connection and extract, so I just want to take a moment to talk about custom SQL connections. So quick show of hands, who uses custom SQL with their data connections at the moment? Okay. Now, raise your hand again if you use it for knowing it's a live connection. Okay, so a few hands there. Now, with extracts, it doesn't make much of an impact, but with the live connection, I would certainly just draw your attention to some of the considerations of using custom SQL there. So here we've got that same chart that we saw before, and it's not really important what it's representing, just that it's a fairly reasonable chart to want to represent in Tableau. And what we have here is a comparison of the native query that's sent by Tableau if you use the native connector, and what's sent via custom SQL. And don't worry if you're not all that proficient in SQL, you probably can't even read it. The point is, you can probably appreciate that the custom SQL option is far longer and far less efficient than the native option. And that's really because of this selected area. This area is just the fixed SQL statement, SQL definition at the point of connection. And that is going to be part of every subquery, part of every query as a subquery for every action that you make in Tableau from that point forwards. So just be aware of that when you're using custom SQL with a live connection. Now, one of the biggest blockers in deploying performant dashboards at scale is how to deal with big volumes of data. And I often see customers that struggle to get started when they've got a lot of data, and customers struggle when their sets of data just grow naturally. And adopting a tiered approach to data storage is a really great way to sort of get around that issue. So the general premise is that you can sort of tier different types of data into three tiers. So cold being the unstructured data, which is often in things like Hadoop, so areas that are good at storing masses of data, not so much querying. Prepared data sources, so your warm data sets that are in relational databases, a little better at being able to access data for querying, and the hot tier of storage. So this is your aggregated data sets, which are in things like hyper extracts. So really accessible and in theory really snappy for those subsets. And just to walk through that concept in an example, this simple line chart, pretty simple, but don't let it fool you. It's actually being supported by almost 92 million rows, which is sort of unnecessary. So definite potential to aggregate that up to a more sensible data set. Now you can use Tableau Prep Builder to do that, certainly. Or if you don't have access to Tableau Prep Builder, you can make use of the options when making an extract to get that going. Now just to recap, what we're able to do is aggregate that set of data for that line chart up to just 20 rows as opposed to using 92 million rows. And what that's done is sort of upgrade it from using a cold tier of storage to a hot tier of storage. And so the general idea is to make sure that you use the appropriate tier for the appropriate visualization when working with large levels of data. But what you get is different data sources, separate data sources for the different levels of storage that you might have in a workbook. And you don't really want to sacrifice interactivity. So what Tableau is able to give you is cross-database filtering to make sure that you're still able to interact and drill down despite it being, the data being held in separate data sources. Okay, so our last practical. Let's switch over to this example. So I've just highlighted those that are in a cold tier of storage that we're going to change in this blue outline. And what we're going to do is initially boost performance by setting the dashboard size to fixed. So that's fixed. I then want to aggregate my data for my highlight table. And for this, what you can do is actually just cut and paste the relevant sheet. So if you hit copy and paste that into a new workbook, let's go here, and paste that in, you're then able to leverage the ability to replace a data source in a different workbook. So this is switching a cold tier of storage that underpins this highlight table for a hot one, which goes from 92 million rows being used to 150. And this was just something that I aggregated in Tableau Prep. So now I will replace the data source for the hot one. And I can unpause querying because now it's not going to take ages to load. And you can see that that sort of snapped in pretty well. I'll just rename this my hot. And do a similar thing for my map. So copy this one in and replace the data source for a warm tier of storage. So these are now using different data sources that are at different levels of aggregation. And if we go back to our dashboard, we can then use a nifty little feature which sort of went under the radar a little bit. So the ability to switch sheets to bring that in. Now, one key step is to actually copy the sheet back into the original dashboard. So literally cut and paste. And now we have our highlight table, which I'm now going to switch out. So if I select that sheet and just swap out that one for the one that uses the hot tier of storage, exactly the same visualization, but just using a smarter set of data. And just to emphasize that you can still filter to a different tier of storage, I'll just set up the dashboard action for that. So my hot airline sheet will now filter my destination map, or my origin map, rather. Let's see if the initial setup will work. OK, just conscious of time. Let's move on. OK, so what that was in theory was combining the filtering abilities to drill down into different tiers of storage and being able to use the cross-data source filtering to not compromise on being able to do that despite having separate data sources, so that you can still optimize the different levels of data that you're using whilst allowing your users to interactively drill down into those granular rows of data that they might want to access every now and again. All right, so just to recap, we've covered a lot of ground here in not very much time. But now that you've seen the theoretical side and some of the practical side as well, hopefully you can now start adopting these techniques to start applying to your dashboards to make sure that they're more intuitive, more insightful, and more scalable. With that, let me know if you found this session helpful. Otherwise, I'm happy to hang back for questions. And thanks so much for coming.